Всім добрий вечір.
On behalf of the brave, on behalf of every father and every mother who waits for freedom, on behalf of our warriors, and paves the way for a new history.
So I believe we have our guest here, Erlend. So I guess I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. Welcome so much back to the stream, Fabian. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing very well, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfectly.
Excellent.
Yeah, so Fabian, you're still working at your doctorate at the University of Oslo, right?
Yes, until April 2026, until the war is going to interrupt us, then probably a bit longer.
Okay.
Getting right into it. We have really got a very optimistic tone.
We have to arrange a coffee or something with some of the other people. Still haven't gotten around to do that yet, but
Before it's
happy to have you in my city, man. Well, so I invited you because I think you have a lot of interesting perspectives on some of the things that have happened during the last week, which has been rather turbulent. Personally, I wouldn't say that I didn't expect any of these things that have come out from the United States, but when they all happen, basically all these statements and plans that they have presented basically are laid out in 1 week. It's kind of overwhelming. So I thought we could frame this as why a forced peace deal would be an absolutely terrible idea, not just for Ukraine, but also for Europe. And then I thought we could also go in a little bit into detail of how an imagined peace mission would look like and why it's fairly unrealistic that Europe can actually commit to that. But I'll just ask you, why is it such a bad idea for Europe? And then we can probably go into Ukraine a little bit later.
Yeah, so let's start with what happened, right? What you just mentioned over this last week or so. And, over the last 2 years, I would say I was constantly one of the people in Europe that painted these worst case scenarios. And I think as a European, especially as a German, I think we've really lost the ability to think in worst case scenarios. I think it was a bit easier for me because I come from nuclear strategy field, right? So we constantly think about nuclear related issues in terms of worst case outcomes and worst case scenarios and what are the bleakest developments that can occur that lead us to total Armageddon. This week we've seen why it's important to think about these types of developments also in worst case scenarios, because I think, one of those just has happened. And again, it's shocking that our decision makers are as ill prepared as they currently are. It's not like we didn't have months and in fact years to prepare for an outcome like this, where Europe is, it looks like going to be fully alone with the situation in Ukraine. In the best case, in the worst case, even the United States is actively going over our heads and potentially at a somewhat later stage collaborating with Russia more than with us. I think that's absolutely out there as an option right now. And this is, again, the baseline planning I would advocate for we do right now. And that means, the strongest possible measures. I mean, why is it a bad deal? Because in the end, right, if you have something like a forced peace deal where Ukraine loses everything, Russia maybe does not win everything, but at least doesn't get punished, you will have rewarded Russia's imperial ambitions while not sufficiently weakened it. That is a perfect recipe for a follow-on war in Ukraine, where Russia will try to gain full political control over Kyiv, or at least get even more territorial control over non-occupied territory at this point. And then, I think there's also a fairly high likelihood that with the United States leaving the European continent, even if it does not fully withdraw from NATO, I think it's pretty clear right now that in an Article 5 scenario, the United States may not necessarily come to our aid. That means we're alone with Russia. And that means Russia would have every incentive to challenge this NATO Article 5 right? Not in the sense that they would want to take the Baltics or Finland or whatnot, right? It would really not be about territorial control in such a NATO-Russia contingency. It would much more be about politically destroying NATO and Article 5 commitment once and for all. Because in the end, right, you would have, and that's what the Russians would speculate, is that without the United States, you would have a scattered response in Europe. You would not really have leadership. States like France, Germany, UK would not amass sufficient forces and fast enough to come to the aid of the Baltic allies or other Eastern European and Northern European allies. And hence, the alliance as such is done with. And then, of course, that gives Russia carte blanche for future scenarios where they can just, satisfy all their imperial ambition.
Yeah. So one thing I want to ask you, why is it actually such a big threat? Why is Russia such a big threat in a very short period of time? Because I remember, was it a year ago, you said 2 to 3 years, and now we're saying
1 to 2 years, absolutely.
1 to 2 years.
Yeah.
But everyone is saying that Russia needs like 5 years to rearm itself to its former strength. But why is that short timeline something that you emphasize so much?
Yeah, so those scenarios where Russia gives us 5 to 7 years, that's a scenario where we assume that before Russia would challenge us, they would try to regain their former strength as what they had prior to the war in Ukraine. And I think that's wrong on 2 dimensions. First of all, on a material level, I think even within 7 years, even within 9 years, Russia is not going to get, back to its former strength. I mean, the manpower is lost. It's tremendous. The deep stocks and reserves from Soviet times, they are pretty much exhausted. It's not going to get that back. Russia is not producing enough, even with the war economy working on full throttle. It's right, like those arsenals are not going to rebuild themselves. But here's the kicker: Russia also doesn't need that. Russia does not, in order to confront us and challenge NATO Article 5, right? Again, it's not about steamrolling NATO and European NATO from Tallinn to Lisbon. That's not the goal. It's about challenging NATO Article 5 and prove to NATO allies in the East that those political commitments given to them by especially Western European allies, but also others, that they're worthless. And Russia can achieve that without taking full control of major parts of NATO territory, right? And I've outlined those scenarios, which I think are quite likely in that regard, and actually which, did not emerge in my head, but it's if you study Russian literature on military strategy, on how they think they can defeat us, because they've always planned, right, for exactly this scenario where they're materially inferior, because they know that in the end, right, Europe is materially a lot stronger than Russia is and ever can be. So they have come up with strategies and plans to defeat us within this state of material inferiority. One thing they could do, for example, is amass enough troops to take a substantial part of the Baltics territory, right? Don't know exactly how much, but, substantial enough that it's, let's say, more than a couple of kilometers. Then, right, you take that part of the territory, then you escalate, you launch massive missile salvos against Western European states, Northern European states, Southern European states. You tell the population of these states that as long as they resist Russia, the suffering, the pain that they experience is only going to increase. It's not going to get better from here. Right? From day one, the civilian population in major NATO population centers is directly affected. And then Russia is going to send out the message that any NATO attempt, right, any attempt from Western European allies, like Germany, like France, like the UK, like Poland, to kick out the Russians from this strip of Baltic territory that they have taken would result in nuclear escalation. And then you're going to look at Berlin right now, right, the chancellor that we have in Berlin right now, or you look at some other European leaders. Do you seriously believe that they would not, maybe not directly falter, but that they would be extremely steadfast in their response and just ignore this Russian threat and go full into the Baltics to kick out the Russians? I mean, that's what the Russians are speculating on, right? That like there's enough hesitation to then destroy this NATO Article 5 political commitment. And the last point here, right? Because that's then always where people say, oh, Fabian, but that's so unrealistic, right? Like, the Russians, they could never do that, and they would never do that. And NATO is strong enough. And the thing is, that's great if you believe that that's the case. And I also believe that, being a German, I have serious doubts about my government right now. But I do believe that if push comes to shove, a majority of German society would stand behind its Eastern European allies. But in the end, it does not matter what I think, right? That's completely irrelevant. Maybe my grandma cares about that. But in the end, the only ones that we have to convince in the room are the Russians themselves, right? The Russians have to understand that if they try such a scenario, if they go in with this attempt to force out NATO Article 5 commitment and make us fail, that they themselves would fail at doing that. And quite honestly, I do not believe that we're doing a very good job at this right now. And that's why I'm extremely concerned about this.
Yeah, so what we would have to do is to actually pose such a threat for this kind of scenario that you're proposing, that Russia doesn't even want to try it. Right?
It's not about us presenting a threat. It's about us deterring Russia, right? And that's about creating a denial capability, right? I think we have, for example, we have to deny like this initial land gain by Russia. Basically, this is the type of forward defense that NATO always talked about in the pre-war years as being highly unrealistic, right? This idea that, we would, the Baltics are lost anyways. And basically it's not about about defending the Baltics. It's about counterattacking through Poland to regain the territory. I think those times are over. I really think, if NATO, and especially Europe is serious about its survival, then we have to start thinking about, establishing this type of forward defense where we're not going to give in a single inch, right? Where we defend the Baltics and Romania, and Poland and other frontline states at the border, right? We're not going to give in. We're not even going to give Russia this opportunity to create these coercive leverage scenarios where they believe they could get away with threatening us into submission.
Yeah, because basically what we've learned from the war in Ukraine is that whenever Russia is managed to capture a territory, it is extremely difficult to kick them out again, right? So let's just look at the scenario where the front line is frozen more or less around these the ones that we have today. And what do you think Russia is going to do? They have a formidable force, at least numerous, in the occupied territories, but also in the adjacent territories inside Russia. What do you think they're going to do with them? And why are they a threat to other Eastern European countries like, I guess, Romania, the Baltics, and also Finland, Norway, and maybe even Sweden?
I mean, so if you look at Ukraine, my assessment of the situation is that neither Ukraine nor Russia can make major territorial gains. I think this war then will be decided. It is an attritional war at this point, right? It's about who can stay in longer. And I'm still fully convinced that if Europe puts its full weight behind Ukraine and finally starts mobilizing its defense industries to a sufficient extent, has a lot more endurance than Russia. But if that doesn't happen, if we leave Ukraine alone, then indeed it is quite. It could be quite a bleak future. I mean, yeah, there are reserves on Russia's side. But I mean, right now at this very moment, I think most Russian forces, basically all of them, are concentrated in Ukraine. I also don't believe that right now in this very moment or tomorrow or next month, the Russians would start something, right? That's why I say in a worst case scenario, we have to be prepared in a year from now or 1.5 years or 2 years or something like that, right? Because I do believe that Russia, they would not go blindly into this type of risk, right, which still attacking NATO and challenging NATO Article 5, that is a risk for the Russians. They would not blindly rush into that. So I think there would be, some time where they can recuperate some forces, do some planning, and then it becomes really dangerous. I think right now, if you ask me specifically in this moment, I think Russia is almost fully committed on, or pretty much fully committed on Ukraine.
But let's take the scenario where some sort of deal or ceasefire is made, and Russia pulls out half of its fighting force, reconstitutes it somewhere in Russia, and continue its production of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, etc. will Europe in 1 to 2 years from now be able to even build up to being able to actually stop them at the border, right? Let's take the Baltic scenario, not let them 1 inch in. Would European forces be able to do that in 1 to 2 years from now?
Well, look, do I think within 1 or 2 years we can build up all the forces that I would like us to have? I don't think so. But the neat thing about deterrence, right? This is a good quote from the Cold War. You only need 5% certainty to deter your adversary and 95% certainty to reassure your allies, right? That's the issue that the United States was dealing with during the Cold War. That basically, you had to explain West Germany in full detail how exactly you would defend them and why, a defense is airtight. But the Soviets were probably deterred by much less certainty. I think we're kind of dealing the same with that, right? I don't think we have to build an airtight case that 100% we can establish this forward line of defense, which in all honesty, right, we could have gotten there if we had made serious preparations years ago, but that train has left the station. What we can still do if we go in a very determined way right now, right, and really do what is needed to also get our capital intensive industry started and build tanks and IFVs and planes and whatnot at scale and missiles, then I think we are in a position where we can build on the Russian side sufficient levels of uncertainty, right? Uncertainty in the sense that they don't know for sure if it's going to be worth it, if the risk is going to pay off, that they would hesitate and would not go through with it. So I'm more optimistic about deterring Russia rather than defending the scenario that I just outlined once that scenario is in play. And again, right, this is really a good case to make for why we should deter Russia rather than fight a war with them.
But isn't deterring Russia a lot more effective if we actually fully commit to Ukrainian defense and also supporting them right now? Because
for sure it is, right? That's also what I said, that I think right now Russia is fully committed to Ukraine. And as long as we make sure that Russia is fully committed to Ukraine, I think we buy ourselves more time. Again, I think Russia would want to have some type of breathing room. Doesn't mean like a complete end to the fighting. It could, for example, be a significant slowdown in the intensity, or, it could be some types of precarious peace deal or something like that. I think the Russians would want some type of breathing room. Of course, I can't look into the heads of decision makers. So the longer or the more time we buy us in Ukraine and the more we support the Ukrainians, that they can effectively fight the Russians and ideally still, right, defeat them, which I still think is totally possible. If we do what is necessary, then we're good, right? That is one option of making sure that the Russians are not going to become a threat to us. And the other point is, right, deterrence is material capability and what we call resolve. The willingness to remain steadfast if push comes to shove. Right? That's how I explain it in a bit more layman's terms. So basically, and we do that by signaling to Russia that we're willing to take risks, that we are willing to accept risks to our own societies, that we are more pain tolerant than the Russians assume we are right now. And the best way we do that, of course, is by putting our full support behind Ukraine, even if that means that we accept, some residual risks to ourselves. And this is going to make an impression with the Russians, right? They're not going to just see that and ignore that. If we show to them that we are resolved actors, they will take that into account in their planning. So I think we have an excellent case to make that at this point still, the best defense or the best way to deter Russia is through Ukraine. If that fails, we have to be ready within a year or two.
And one of those deterring or the determinations from Europe could be demonstrated by, for instance, deploying forces in Ukraine already before you start about talking about a peace deal or ceasefire, right? For instance, there's been proposals of having training missions somewhere in the east of, in the west of Ukraine, and there's also been talks about deploying some sort of force in Kyiv as a sort of demonstration that we are going to make sure or stand by Ukraine and make sure that Kyiv survives in any sort of escalation further than this. I mean,
Yeah.
like this week we've heard Ukraine saying that the Russians are planning another attack from Belarus, etc. So
Yeah.
that could definitely be a very, very strong signal to Russia, right?
That would be a signal, right? That's what I just said. That that's what we as Europeans have to be clear about, is that if we go in there, right, if we put troops into Ukraine, especially at the border, there is a real risk that would draw us into the conflict. There is a real risk that will make us end up in a shooting fight with the Russians. So we shouldn't downplay that. But there may be the point, maybe the point has come now, maybe it will come in 6 months or 12 or later, where we have to do that, right? Where we believe that the risk of not taking that decision are outweighing the risks of going in. And if that point has come, then yeah, definitely we have to go in. And if we then signal that correctly to the Russians, right, I think then it also takes a bit of broader diplomatic military efforts also outside of Ukraine, then that would be or could be a very effective way of signaling this type of resolve that I've talked about to the Russians.
And that may be some of the things that Macron has tried to do with his...
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, but then instead of actually doing it, it's been mostly empty words, and that's
and the problem is that you have people like, I mean, especially Scholz and Biden back then, who immediately saw the risk of doing that as outweighing the risk of a Ukrainian defeat, right? I mean, that's always what it comes down to. Do we think whatever cost a Ukrainian defeat would impose on ourselves, does that outweigh the risk of potentially getting drawn into the war? And I think Macron has tried to bring up this discussion that, a Ukrainian defeat would be incredibly costly, and that potentially we have to take certain risks in order to make sure that this type of future does not materialize. But you have Scholz and Biden back in the days who immediately shut that down, right? For them, the worst case scenario was not Ukrainian defeat, but entering into war with Russia. And that's why that type of thing hasn't materialized, and we just have to see how it continues in the future. I mean, I do believe that a Ukrainian defeat would pose an existential threat to our way of life, and also, territorially to some of our Eastern European allies. So, I think averting that type of risk justifies taking on substantial risk.
Yeah, and that may that's something I may agree with you on, that it poses a threat not just to us physically and kinetically, but also on a long term, our way of life, our democracy, and our system being completely eradicated over time, because that's one of Russia's strengths, right? So
I mean, this is it, right? Like this is either Europe stands up now, or in the best case scenario, we fade into irrelevance, or we become, this pushover actor between the United States and Russia. So, this is do or die. like live or lay down Europe.
And then what risk are you willing to take to make sure that doesn't happen? And in my opinion, that the threshold should be relatively high, because we're talking about basically everything that we care and love about. So in our societies, right? So
I mean, I will say, right? This is the one thing, that if we have to confront the Russians alone, if the Americans are out of the equation, it looks conventionally, of course, it's a lot worse for us. I think the nuclear escalation risks are quite substantially reduced, actually. So I think I think with the Americans out, the likelihood that we have to fight a large-scale conventional war rises tremendously, but the risk that this war escalates to the strategic nuclear level, meaning counter-city targeting, I think that paradoxically reduces.
Interesting. Well, I guess we can start moving on to a little bit different topic, and but before that, if some of the other people in the panel has comments or questions, maybe you can throw them out right now.
I had one thought about the earlier comment about deterrence. What happens if Russia miscalculates again, like they did in Ukraine? We can't rely too much on the perception of deterrence. After all, I mean, Russia has shown that it acts irrationally from time to time, and I think it's also a big risk for us. The world has, or at least now not only the Russians are becoming less irrational, also the Americans, etc. And it's a kind of a new world where the deterrence that may have worked in the past will not work anymore.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing with deterrence, right? It's entirely perception based. Two actors look at one situation and both will necessarily probably see something either slightly different or very different. So our task is to think about ways and devices that we can use to signal to the Russians as effectively as possible that we will either deny an attack, meaning they will not achieve their military objectives, or that we are able to impose sufficient punishment to make it not worthwhile. I think we can do that, but in the end, right, misperceptions happens, miscalculation happens, meaning that is a risk. I mean, for Ukraine, right? I think or when it comes to the Ukraine war, I think the Russians definitely miscalculated. But then again, I also think the West didn't really do a good job in helping the Russians assess the situation correctly. So I think this is a two-way street, and I think from our side, we just have to do our best to deter the Russians and install the types of perceptions that we want them to have of us, and then we see if it works. And if we do what is needed, I'm quite optimistic that we can. But yeah, you never get 100% certainty.
And one of the ways that we could have helped the Russians to understand better that they wouldn't succeed in their plan would have been to demonstrate Ukrainian firepower, like we used to do in the Cold War, right? When we had these massive exercises, and then we invited all the Soviet generals and had an enormous fire display at the end of the exercise. That was one of the things that we were doing to kind of demonstrate our power, and also invite the Russians to come and look at our bases stacked full of equipment. I mean, none of these things were happening before 2022. Okay. Well, so I thought I would try and go towards what the Americans have tried to project on Ukraine, basically, and Europe. And we had the Secretary of Defense Hegseth coming with some pretty bold and dramatic statements, and I've picked two. One is the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of negotiated settlement. Instead, security guarantees should be backed by capable European and non-European troops. So then we already have like one of the deterrences that were possible kind of stricken out of any possible future. Of course, he's kind of rolled back on that or put some doubt into that phrase that he said something like nothing is off the table, but this was initially what he said. And then he said if these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as a part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. This basically puts a lot of pressure on Europe. And Zelensky has been prepared for this because even before these statements, he has claimed, or at least tried to communicate, that Ukraine would need a force of around 100 to 150,000 troops. I think he said 125,000 once and 150,000 once. I've never seen him actually saying 100,000, but this was just some media reports that I've cut out, and some media reports have speculated that Europe can basically muster 30 to 40,000 strong force, and none of these figures are really confirmed. I tried to go in a kind of a middle way, so I assumed 100,000 because I think that is more realistic for deterrence, and even though it's not realistic that we could actually muster this. And one of the things that I don't think a lot of people understand is that, let's say that there is 100,000 strong force on the front lines, because that's what we're talking about, a fighting force. That's what's been mentioned. Then you would have, you wouldn't only need those 100,000 troops, you would need 3 times that figure because of the way we are operating in Western forces, especially at NATO forces. We normally have a rotation basis, which is 1 to 3. So one part is undergoing training, and one part is deployed while one part is resting, and then the cycle starts again. That would require at all times 300,000 European and non-European, as they said, but I'm kind of doubtful to the non-European part there, fighting forces. In addition to that force to be realistically capable of deterring Russian attacks and actually being able to fight if something happens, because I assume that is what Zelensky is basically demanding here. You would need support and logistics personnel in addition to that. And normally we assume something around 1 to 3 there as well. So one part is fighting and 2 parts are in the rear, and even more. Actually, that is a very low requirement for support and logistics. In over 18 months, that would muster 900,000 people. But of course, there are some variations in how long a rotation would last for people in logistics and support. Maybe some would be civilian contractors, etc. But would this even be possible, Fabian? That is my question here.
Honestly, I'm not entirely sure if I can give a satisfying answer to that, because I'm not a logistics expert or the type of crowned army expert that you probably would need for that. Okay, again, right? I think 300,000 troops for 6 months. That's not impossible.
That would be 300,000, while 100 is in training, 100 is deployed, and 100 is resting. So that's
my gut feeling is, right, literally I'm doing your vibes-based analysis, right, as I call it, because I don't have hard data on that. I would say that's not an impossible number, but yeah, for sure it would be extremely challenging. And then if you think about drawing this out, you probably would need more than that, and then it becomes really, really difficult. I also think, again, right, if we do this kind of deployment, especially if the Americans are out and they explicitly say that NATO troops in Ukraine or European NATO troops in Ukraine are not covered by Article 5, that means 100% the Russians are going to challenge that in some way. They're going to do some shenanigans. They're going to escalate in some way. They're going to try and figure out how serious we are. So if we put our men and women there, we then better make sure that they can defend ourselves. And we also have contingency plans in hand, right? That we can bring to bear if need be. So yeah, the challenge then is beyond those deployed resting and training troops. It's also that we need to have more equipment, material, and manpower ready to respond in case of a certain scenario materializing where Russia escalates trust.
Yeah. So my assumption in this scenario, and let's say that we start with 100,000 combat troops, right? Which means a committed 300,000 strong force. We start out with that, and then we go out to all the different nations that would have to be participating in that. They would then start planning seriously, or actually doing service for what is possible to do. At that moment, you would have various intelligence agencies doing risk assessments for those kind of missions. And my assessment is that we will have 2 very important crucial points where personnel would potentially die or be injured. And one is undetonated ordnance, so UXO, and mines. And I assess that the likelihood of NATO or European forces dying or being injured is almost certain. And then you have the risk that there would be some sort of flare-up of the conflict or targeted attacks that could be even unintentional misunderstandings or intentional. And I think my assessment is that it is very likely to happen in the span of, like, let's say 3 years, which is a very short term. This peacekeeping mission would probably last something like 10 to 15 years minimum, right? So at that point, I assume a lot of European nations would withdraw completely from the whole mission when they realize how likely it is that people will die. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that needs to be a consideration. We all need to be aware that most likely that means NATO men and women will die in Ukraine. 2 other considerations that I find quite concerning is that I think it would be quite likely that Russia launches air attacks into NATO. Don't know exactly how deep, but I think Poland or the Baltics are quite likely, perhaps in response to some infringement that they believe we did in Ukraine, right? That they make up some scenario where we reportedly attacked them and then they had to respond and punish us by launching missiles into NATO territory. And then we have to be, it has to be very, very clear that if Russia launches missiles into our territory, we launch back at them. I think that has to be a given, that if they attack our homeland, we attack right back. You cannot let that stand. You cannot then be there, oh yeah, but we had air defense in place, and we need more air defense to prevent that in the future. If you do it again, you're all in or not. So then you launch back. And I sometimes wonder, or not sometimes, I wonder very often if we have the decision makers in place to make that decision, right? Again, knowing that this entails risks, but I think not reacting entails greater risks, but I'm not sure if they share this cost-benefit analysis. And then the other thing, and this is perhaps the thing I'm almost most concerned about, I mean, in Germany right now, you have, 20% for the AfD, you have 5% and 5% for the BSW and the Left Party. So that means you have almost 1/3 of voters, maybe 25% of society, who very clearly are pro-Russian in their outlook when it comes to Ukraine. That means you have to upkeep this type of deployment against the, at the best case, negative indifference from a large part of your population. And in the worst case, you will have a significant segment of your society that will work actively against you, both within legal and potentially also illegal spheres, to make your life a lot harder while this already very difficult deployment is ongoing in Ukraine. So yeah, this is it's tremendously challenging, and I find it somewhat frightening. So I still believe we should do everything to just make sure that the Ukrainians win this and that the Russians do not get out of this war with some type of victory without being significantly weak.
Yeah. So when presented with all the risks that this kind of peace mission would come with, I think that the Scholzes and Bidens and other people would be very shocked, because they have been acting assuming that this is less risky than for instance, sending personnel into Ukraine to train or perform air defense tasks or something to that sort, right? Or even sending certain weapon systems. So for me, the equation of also just the cost that this would pose on us, and also probably put quite some difficulties in our own buildup of forces that is for us, because we would have to concentrate enormous amounts of effort to train the people, to plan, to build up logistics, bases even. This kind of missions you can't have 100,000 people living in tents. You would have to actually build structures and logistics infrastructure as well, and that is extremely costly. And I wonder, are politicians even presented with the costs that this kind of mission would pose on us, and risks, of course?
I wonder if they are presented with the costs, the real costs of Ukrainian defeat in general, right? Or in defeat, including something that necessitates this type of mission. I mean, there's so much on top of that. No, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know how aware they are. I believe if they were fully aware, they would have to act differently, but maybe I'm wrong, right? I start to feel some type of resignation there, because I feel like so many analysts, myself included, have, almost screamed against the wall that there are horrible costs entailed in failing to support Ukraine to the extent that is needed. So they should know, but either they don't or they ignore it.
Understood.
I see the question to Fabian. How would the situation change when Ukraine would have some kind of nuclear deterrence? Ooh, yeah, that one is back. Yes. Oh man, I mean, of course, that would fundamentally change the situation. The question is, A, how likely is it for Ukraine to acquire some type of nuclear deterrent? And B, how likely is it for Ukraine to acquire what we call a robust nuclear deterrent, right? So question one, Ukraine right now they don't have the means to race for a bomb right at this moment. That means they would have to build up supporting infrastructure that includes in particular plutonium reprocessing plants that would be able, right? So basically, right, the easiest way for Ukraine would be to take some of that plutonium that they get out of their light water reactors, reprocess that to extract the plutonium-239, which you need to. No, sorry, I don't know which isotope it is. I don't know. Anyway, it's just some type of plutonium, right? That you need to get the fissile material, which then will result in the bomb or the warhead. So they would have to build it up. Probably would take like 1 to 2 years. Very, very difficult to hide that. And then also, diverting the plutonium from the nuclear plants towards that secret reprocessing plant. It would not be feasible to hide that from the IAEA and probably also international intelligence services, including Russia. So, this would not happen in the dark, but people would know that it would be going on, which means that Russia would probably start launching preemptive attacks against Ukraine's nuclear infrastructure, which would be really bad because a large part of Ukraine's remaining energy comes from its nuclear power plants. They would be bombed and destroyed. So on top of the radiation things that are happening then, you would also mean there would be much more severe energy situation, electricity provision in terms of that. Yeah, so I don't think that's realistic, but let's say even if you say that's somehow realistic and they would get that done, Ukraine would also, at best possess a very, very small amount of nuclear warheads and nuclear weapons, and it's not a robust nuclear deterrent. It would be incredibly vulnerable to some type of Russian nuclear or non-nuclear first strike. So it would be a type of minimal credibility nuclear deterrent, which is it means something. It's not useless, but yeah, it would not be the same as British or French submarine-based nuclear deterrent. I know people. I get that asked all the time now by journalists and just people on Twitter and Blue Sky. How likely is it for Ukraine to get a nuclear weapon and also for European states? Honestly, if I believe there was a straightforward pathway for either of those actors to do that, European states or Ukraine, I probably advocate for it. I just don't see it happen, unfortunately. I think in Europe, especially, we've been somewhat stupid that we purposefully and systematically reduced our what we call nuclear latency, right? Like the nuclear infrastructure that you would need to build a bomb if you make that decision. We've made incredibly proliferation resistant nuclear infrastructure in Europe, right? Got rid of our heavy water reactors, only built light water reactors. Our reprocessing plants are either very small scale or not available anymore, and we send our plutonium elsewhere for reprocessing, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, incredibly difficult, not impossible, but yeah, I don't know if we should get too caught up on that.
So I'll ask the question a little bit differently. What if European countries that want to have a European nuclear umbrella over them pay current nuclear powers in Europe to extend that, maybe even leasing or deploying nuclear weapons within armed forces of Europe, like the US have done before?
So the only way that would be anything close to European is if you would have warheads and weapons physically in other member states that also can autonomously and independently use them. If that's not the case, then you have basically the current scenario. And with forward deployed American nuclear weapons in Europe, right, where you need to have two keys, one of the state where they're deployed in Europe, so Germany, Italy, Turkey, Belgium, or the Netherlands, and the United States. Or you have the same situation as we have now, minus the Americans, where, the French said that they appreciate the vital interests, the vital European interests, which they might defend or which they are willing to defend with their nuclear deterrence. So basically, right, they're implying that their nuclear umbrella is extended over other member states. And as a German or as a Dutch person, a Belgian person, I think that's quite credible because, right, if the Russians get to Berlin or Stuttgart or The Hague or Brussels, there is a good chance they will also make it to Paris. So, right, like an existential threat to these countries probably also means an existential threat to France. but it's very different for the Baltic states or Norway or Finland or Sweden or Romania. So, right, I think there really you get the same issue that you have to basically trust the French that they will retaliate on your behalf when your existence is threatened, knowing very well that that means that Paris and any other major population hub in France will die in response, even though they're not, existentially threatened at that very moment. So that just inherently lacks credibility. So yeah, that's the option. Like if you want to have anything akin to a European nuclear deterrent, that means physical warhead location in other member states plus autonomous and independent ability to launch.
And what are France and the UK's capabilities of providing those weapons, right?
I mean, they could provide the fissile material, for example. If Germany was fully determined to acquire a nuclear capability, arguably they would be the major. So there would be two major, or let's say three hurdles, right? The first one is the biggest one is acquiring the fissile material. And there, the British and the French, they could step in fairly easily. The French better than the British ones because they have a more robust nuclear program, which is also geared more towards military outputs. So the French, they could just, increase, let's say, their plutonium production or plutonium reprocessing and, get a couple dozen critical quantities or significant quantities, I think is what the IAEA calls it. So like a critical mass that you would need for a bomb, so a significant quantity to Berlin. Berlin would then take that and ask a warhead manufacturer, probably TDW, which is the leading missile warhead manufacturer, to create a nuclear device out of that fissile material. Basically, how you would do that is you have like a plutonium sphere. That plutonium sphere needs to be collapsed in on itself. You do that by exploding extremely symmetrically conventional explosives around that sphere. So you compress that sphere and then the fission process starts, right? That's how you get then the nuclear explosion. So I think TDW or also other types of warhead manufacturers, base systems, right? They also do that. Right. So there are probably several manufacturers, but I would say TDW is really primed to do that. They could get that done fairly fast, couple of months if you really, really wanted to get it done. And then you have to integrate that into a missile system, let's say like Taurus. That's the final barrier or hurdle. And that might take another couple of months. That what you then need to do is you need to validate the system and rebalance it and blah, blah, blah. So, but that's not that big of a deal. Really, the biggest hurdle would be to acquire the fissile material. And if France and the UK were determined to provide that to European states, then we're in. then we have more European nuclear powers suddenly, I would say.
And I think that is probably the most likely outcome if we here in Europe assess that the American nuclear umbrella is no longer as strong as it used to be in its prime time.
I mean, it would be one thing that would be interesting then is if the Americans would accept it, if they would support it, or if they would actively oppose it, right? If they're either indifferent or supporting, then I think it's not going to say fairly straightforward, but a lot easier. If they actively oppose it, then the economic costs and political costs are going to be tremendous. There's also a danger still, right? Russia might want to go preemptively after our fledgling nuclear arsenals. I'm not saying they have an international basis, but they might have a basis in international law, but they might have something that approaches that. I mean, Israel, they bombed Osirak in Iraq in 1981, which was a research reactor, which was built for nuclear fissile material production. And then they bombed in, I think, 2012 or 2013, a Syrian nuclear research reactor, which was also supposed to build fissile material. And there was no large-scale condemnation. Again, there is no clear international law out there on it. Given that these types of attacks weren't strongly condemned by most of the international community, Russia could probably claim that, by conducting these preemptive strikes, nuclear or non-nuclear, well, nuclear would be a different thing, but at least as long as they're non-nuclear, they could claim that they are acting, within the bounds of international law, and they're basically just doing the duty of preventing nuclear proliferation, which many would argue has also become customary international law due to the nuclear proliferation treaty, meaning you don't need any more written in law and being part of a treaty that you say nuclear proliferation is illegal. So even if then Germany or Norway or any other European state would step out of the non-proliferation treaty, right, they could still make the argument fairly effectively, I would say, that no, nuclear proliferation is still illegal because it's a customary international law. And there is a legal basis in preemptively going after emerging nuclear arsenals. So we're acting within international law, and hence we're doing it. And they might also get, support for that internationally from China, India. I think that is something we would have to be fully aware of.
That's another point of how complicated our future is if we don't act now, if we don't let Ukraine handle this, and also make sure that they are more capable than now of defending themselves. So I think all the things that you mentioned, it makes my head kind of explode, because if you combine that with all the added risks of not deterring Russia on the ground in Ukraine, it is a very messy scenario in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Just seeing some comments, I'm not invoking international law because I'm saying it's illegal and oh no, we need to be law-abiding states. I said that, I brought up that point because that's something that Russia will say, right? Russia will do these kinds of strikes and attacks. They will justify it by reference to international law, and we have to then also be prepared that the international community, like China, like India, potentially also the United States, who knows, that they will be behind that, right? That they will say, no, look, that was a fair thing to do by Russia. Right? It doesn't mean that we shouldn't go down that route if we decide to do that. It's just, again, something that we have to be aware of. And this is, I'm trying to say, like, get the full picture. Don't try to paint a reality where this is easy and we just get it done and nothing will happen. Russia will not just stand by and watch us go nuclear. There will be something happening. Again, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I definitely see a scenario where this could be worthwhile and beneficial. But yeah, get the full picture and make the decision based on that.
Last topic would be, and I think Colby can help us a little bit here as well. If the US is fairly passive in its support of Ukraine militarily, let's assume that they will only sell equipment to Ukraine or European allies that will then provide them to Ukraine. Do you think that Europe is able to provide what it takes for the next 1 to 2 years to outlast Russia? Because that's in my time scale what I believe Russia is able to continue, how long they are able to continue this war. We don't need to go into the attrition rates, etc. We can do that another time. That's probably a whole hour of stream just to talk about the attrition rates. But do we have what it takes? And I think both Fabian and Colby can answer to that.
Colby, do you want to go first? And then I add some points maybe.
Sure. So I would say that, yes, theoretically, at least, Europe has the capacity. Europe is collectively is a larger economy than Russia is. Europe has the industrial base. It's just not been activated. And this has been you've heard this from myself and Fabian constantly for 3 years, that European governments have just not activated their existing industrial capabilities. And there's been very lackluster investment into upgrading capabilities or building out new capabilities. And this isn't to say that nothing's been done, because obviously things have been done. You see myself tweeting about it all the time about new factories that are coming online and increases in material production. But these are all still very modest increases in the grand scheme of things. No massive expansions have happened anywhere. And the bigger ones are typically in some of the smaller countries. France, Germany, UK, a lot of the biggest economies have still been putting fairly modest amounts into their defense industrial bases relative to what they could be doing. And there are legitimate reasons for this, namely the EU's rules on deficit spending, which are just severely constraining governments' abilities to make those investments without making cuts or raising taxes, which obviously governments seldom want to do. But this is the problem confronting Europe, is that European governments are just not matching their rhetoric with their actions. They say that what's happening in Ukraine is an existential question for not just Ukraine, but for Europe as a whole. And obviously this is true, but that language for 3 years now has still not been matched by tangible actions. And here we are 3 years later, and the EU is only now finally having a somewhat serious conversation about exempting defense investments from those deficit rules that the EU has. And that is something that should have happened 3 years ago. So a lot of time has been wasted. And had that time not been wasted, then Europe would be, for the most part, fairly sufficient in its ability to provide Ukraine's war material requirements without American support, with few exceptions. I mean, Europe, the only thing that Europe probably couldn't do is ballistic missiles. And even then, like 3 years, I mean, Europe could have spun up a ballistic missile program, probably a conventional ballistic missile program in that time, or be close to fielding one. But Europe already has cruise missiles. They've just chosen not to produce them. Europe produces pretty much everything else that Ukraine needs. It's all just on a very small scale. It's going to be challenging, no doubt, if the United States stops providing any assistance on their own initiative. Arms sales are going to still be on the table. As I've said consistently, I don't think that that's going to be taken off the table. The United States is not going to turn down money if there's willing buyers. But if the United States just stops drawdown, stops making their own new security commitments, it will certainly be challenging for Europe because production is just not on a level where it needs to be to fulfill all of Ukraine's needs. But if they can get the deficit rule changed, then that'll certainly be helpful. But they've wasted a lot of time, and it's going to take time, if they come to an agreement on that, for the money to start flowing into making investments that are needed and getting those new factories stood up. So it will be a challenge, but ultimately I think that Europe, as I said, will still have the option of buying things from the United States. Whatever they can't deliver on their own, they can either buy from the United States, they can continue to buy ammunition on the global market. There's the Czech initiative. There are other countries that have actively been doing this for some time as well, just quietly. So there's lots of options that can still be tapped to get the material that Ukraine needs, but it's certainly it's going to stress resources, no doubt. And at the end of the day, European governments need to be willing to step up and put their money where their mouths are, because they haven't been doing that. And it's just, if European governments want a seat at the quote unquote table, you have to bring something to the table. And we all understand that Europe has done quite a lot for Ukraine so far, but still far, far, far below what they need to, given the existential threat that we've been talking about for an hour and a half now, and what is in Europe's future should Ukraine lose. Obviously, this is an extremely, extremely small price to pay relative to what the cost would be if Europe would have to actually fight a war with Russia on their own. So it's a very, very small price, but that price has still been too big for pretty much most governments in Europe to agree to spend that small price for 3 years now. And now we're at the point where Europe has no option. They either change their policy direction, or, the unthinkable scenarios that Fabian and yourself have been speaking about for an hour now, that's going to be realized.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think, what we've been seeing, and especially these last 6 months, I think has become quite apparent, at least to me, that almost any expansion, pretty much, I would say probably over 90% of the expansion and production capacity that we've seen was led by the manufacturers themselves. So there was really almost no direct government support in Europe. And this had the result that you've seen an expansion in non-capital intensive industries, right? Like in the beginning, we said, for example, that quantum systems and Helsing, like they ramp up their production constantly. And that's because these lightweight drones and shorter range drones, I'm not saying it's cheap to produce them, but you don't need that upfront capital in creating these massive manufacturing halls and precision manufacturing machines and whatnot, right? The things that you need to build more complex, larger systems. And I think what European states really need to do, they now need to go to those manufacturers and really ask them what they need to ramp up production, right? And one thing is, multi-year contracts, as the United States has done, in peacetime for years and years now. That's not really a thing in Europe, with the exception of some very, very minor programs. You might want to subsidize directly, right? Manufacturers increasing production capacities. Again, something the US has done for ages now. I think just last year they awarded $260 million or something to Williams International to build more turbofan engines for CHAS-MER. That's just money they get on top of what they invest themselves to ramp up production. Or literally, you just tell the manufacturer, look, we're gonna build you the manufacturing hall, and you just fill them with people, and we help you get the machines and whatnot ready so you can ramp up production, right? And then you also talk to those workers' councils in those manufacturing facilities that will tell you that they can't work three shifts in a day, right? And you ask them, hey, what do you need to get that done, right? Do you need more safety officers? Do you need more money, right? Do the people need to be paid more? How can we help you to get this done? But we're really at this point in Europe now, I feel like, where we have to find solutions for that, right? And we have to break out of our traditional ways of doing things when it comes to the defense industry, because clearly this has not helped us ramp up production to the extent that it's needed.
Yeah, just to add to this. So it's a bit of a misconception that Europe's arms industry overall is much more state-owned than the United States' arms industry. But despite that, there's still this severe problem where European governments are not willing to make these investments, as Fabian's saying, into industrial base expansion. But the United States is. The United States government owns a handful of different plants, mostly in munitions production, and they operate a very small number of those on their own, and then the rest are operated by contractors. And these plants get a lot of money invested into them by the US government. And in Europe, this is much more challenging, it seems, that a lot of these state-owned, either entirely or partially state-owned firms in Europe, a lot of them are just not getting capital either from the government or from institutional lenders. And again, there's lots of reasons for this. EU regulations around banking and ESG policies as well have been extremely detrimental to the ability of the defense industry in Europe to raise private capital, which is a problem that doesn't exist to the same extent in the United States. And again, this is something that needed to change 3 years ago. And here we are, and Europe is only really still having conversations about these things. Still, a lot of the action has not been taken. So it's easy, again, because, you know, so much of the industry is state-owned. It's not even that you have these private companies that are being very intransigent. You know, as Fabian says, a lot of them have just invested their own money, or whatever expansions they've been able to do is just as a result of them getting contracts. And again, a lot of these contracts are from foreign purchasers as well. It's not even related to Ukraine. And then people wonder why there's still so much war material being produced in Europe that is not going to Ukraine or not going to Europe's own needs. Well, it's because European governments are not buying the war material from their own industry. They are just reliant on their limited export business to keep themselves afloat because they don't get money from their own countries. So this is something that needs to change, and it could change very quickly. And I've pointed this out on Twitter that Italy is a good example of what we might see if the deficit rule is changed, that the Italians have been saying very publicly that they will invest considerably if that rule was changed. So they're the ones to watch whether they come through on that. I suspect they probably will, but you never know. That's my approach, is always wait and see. But the Italian government owns a considerable portion of Italy's defense industrial base, and it'll be very easy for them to start pumping money into it if they can exempt deficit spending from into defense, is if it's exempted from those rules. So there's a very easy framework here to make these investments happen if they are allowed by the EU. And again, I just can't stress enough that this needed to change 3 years ago, and it's imperative that they do this as soon as possible because Ukraine is obviously running out of time.
I think the ASAP program was very interesting, but unfortunately, we should have seen 10 to 15 similar projects, and not just on 155 munitions, right? And the programs themselves should have probably been a lot larger. I think that in combination with changing the depth rules can probably really boost European defense manufacture. And I think, yes, Italy is a very good example. A lot of these companies that are either state-owned or partially state-owned have tried to get investment, both from Italy and from through the ASAP program, etc. But the Italian government was not very happy about the ASAP program for some reason, so they didn't let the companies apply for it. That's very sad because Italy has a very, very good base of being quite a big powerhouse in defense manufacturing in Europe. But I think that a lot of countries would jump on that bandwagon, right? It wouldn't just be Italy.
Yeah, no, and thank you for mentioning the ASAP program. This slipped my mind because this is this is a perfect example of the problem that I'm talking about here. Because the ASAP program was 500 million euros, which is obviously nothing. That's it's peanuts. The United States has invested basically 10 times that amount into their munitions industrial base. We're talking in the magnitude of $5 billion, probably more now. The fact that the EU just could only come up with only $500 million across the entire European bloc to invest in the industrial capacity of the munitions industrial base. This is a joke. As you said, it needs to be way more than that. The EU should have been investing on the same magnitude as the United States. And if they had done that, then we would see that the EU would be able to produce drastically more ammunition right now, because the EU is saying that maybe 2 million rounds of large caliber will be produced this year. So that figure would be way higher if the ASAP program was 10 times bigger, which it should have been. That's the kind of investment that was needed again 3 years ago, and they can't afford to waste another day. Basically, there's a lot of facilities that either got a very small amount of money, because again, 500 million divided by countless different projects, so everybody was basically getting a few bucks from the EU. Countless different facilities, factories, companies that only got a couple of bucks or didn't get any money at all because they didn't even bother to bid because it wasn't worth their time, or they just didn't get selected. So there's a lot of untapped potential on the continent that is just starved of capital. And if they got that capital, they could start increasing production and delivering more war material to Ukraine and to their own militaries.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're going to wrap up, but I think I want to ask Fabian about one last thing. Let's assume that all this fails. Europe doesn't really continue to provide a whole lot, and the US also kind of stops providing most of the equipment that it is providing right now to Ukraine. How long do you think Ukraine can fight, or do you think they can continue to fight at all?
Well, they can fight for a long time, I would say. I mean, as long as Europe stays in there and supports them, then they have a lifeline. And I think Russia is very much unable to create either operational or let alone strategic level breakthroughs. So I think that would I don't think the front line would crumble and Ukraine would simply have to give up. I don't think I think the thing for Ukraine is, and I've tried to make that clear on Twitter and also in some op-eds I wrote over the last few days, Ukraine will not lose that war because it is forced to surrender due to military exhaustion. I think if Ukraine decides to give up, that's a political decision, right? And they believe that the costs of continued resistance outweigh the costs of the settlement that would be imposed on them. So, right, then it's really up to the Ukrainians to decide when that point is reached. And I, of course, really, really hope that we stay in there with them for as long as it takes and make sure that they understand that as long as they are in the fight, we are with them and that they can make a decision based on that. But yeah, I think in any case, with us or without us, with the US or without the US, I don't think this war will be decided because one side is fully unable to continue to resist. I think in the end, this will come down to political.
Yeah, I think that was good final words. My final words will be that it probably is going to cost Europe a hell lot more to not fully commit to Ukraine and let it continue its fight. As they say, they say themselves, they would like to defend their territories, and we should let them. If they decide politically that they want to settle down, then we have to support that as well. But until then, I don't see any reason for why we should either even start to approach what has been presented this week from the Americans. And I think that a lot of the dooming around that messaging is not necessarily warranted, because as lined out here, Europe really can do this if we want to, right? Joseph, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah. So I think we published a new article on the website, right?
Is it published already?
Maybe I should be quiet then.
Well, there is an article coming. It's not yet out, but it's almost done. And I think there's kind of a series of articles that are gonna come out, or at least a couple more, because we've been doing quite some research on a project. I'm helping Daniela with, and some other people. But one of those articles are basically in the approval rate. I think proofreading is the stage where it is at this moment.
Gotcha. Well, look forward to that. Check out Tochnyi.info, SEAL website. Check out all the great research that our team does. So yeah, I want to thank our panel first. I want to thank our special guest, Fabian. Thanks so much for coming on and talking to us about a very important topic. You're welcome on anytime, of course. Thank you, of course, to our panel, Mr. Colby, Mr. Erlend, Terminate to Ukraine, who's, I guess, watching a debate right now, but is with us in spirit. And of course, thanks to live chat for coming and asking all the great questions. We always appreciate that. And the guests always mention they like your guys' questions. So good job as always. And thanks to the people who watch the video on demand. We appreciate you guys. We know not everyone can make it to 2100 Kyiv, as we broadcast every Sunday at 2100 Kyiv time. But if you can't make it, you can always watch the pre-recorded stuff. And yeah, thanks. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see everyone next week. Slava Ukraini.
Heroям слава.
On behalf of the brave.